Hang your head back, and your nose will be all right.
Nora was shedding tears of rage and shame. Mingled with the blood on her face, they made her a fearsome sight. Jim Wilcox looked as if he wished the floor would open and gently drop him in the cellar.
Well,
said Aunt Mouser belligerently,
all you can do now is marry her, Jim Wilcox. She'll never get a husband if it gets around that she was found here with you at 2 o'clock at night. Marry her? Cried Jim in exasperation. What have I wanted all my life but to marry her? Never wanted anything else. Then why didn't you say so long ago? Demanded Nora, whirling about to face him. Say so? You snubbed and frozen and jeered at me for years. You gone out of your way times without number to show me how you despise me. I didn't think it was the least use to ask you. And last January you said, you goaded me into saying it. I goaded you? I like that. You picked a quarrel with me just to get rid of me. I didn't. And yet I was fool enough to tear over here in the dead of night because I thought you put our old signal in the window and wanted me? Ask you to marry me. Well, I'll ask you now, and I'm done with it. And you can have the fun of turning me down before all this gang. Nora, Edith Wilson, will you marry me? Oh, won't I? Won't I? Cried Nora so shamelessly that even Barnabas blushed for her. Jim gave her one incredulous look, then sprang at her. Perhaps her nose had stopped bleeding. Perhaps it hadn't. It didn't matter. I think you've all forgotten that this is the Sabbath morn, said Aunt Mouser, who had just remembered it herself. I could do with a cup of tea if anyone would make it. I ain't used to demonstrations like this. All I hope is poor Nora has really landed him at last. At least she has witnesses. They went to the kitchen, and Mrs. Nelson came down and made tea for them, all except Jim and Nora, who remained closeted in the library with Barnabas for chaperone. Anne did not see Nora until the morning. Such a different Nora, 10 years younger, flushed with happiness. I owe this to you, Anne. If you hadn't set the light, though just for 2.5 minutes last night, I could have chewed your ears off. And to think I slept through it all, moaned Tommy Nelson heartbrokenly. But the last word was with Aunt Mouser. Well, all I hope is it won't be a case of marrying in haste and repenting at leisure. Chapter 17. Extract from letter to Gilbert. School closed today. 2 months of Green Gables and dew-wet spicy ferns ankle-deep along the brook, and lazy dappling shadows in Lover's Lane, and wild strawberries in Mr. Bill's pasture, and the dark loveliness of firs in the haunted wood. My very soul has wings. Jen Pringle brought me a bouquet of lilies of the valley and wished me a happy vacation. She's coming down to spend a weekend with me sometime. Talk of miracles! But little Elizabeth is heartbroken. I wanted her for a visit, too, but Mrs. Campbell did not deem it advisable. Luckily, I hadn't said anything to Elizabeth about it, so she was spared that disappointment. I believe I'll be Lizzie all the time you're away, Miss Shirley, she told me. I'll feel like Lizzie anyway. But think of all the fun we'll have when I come back, I said. Of course you won't be Lizzie. There's no such person as Lizzie in you. And I'll write to you every week, little Elizabeth. Oh, Miss Shirley, will you? I've never had a letter in my life. Won't it be fun? And I'll write you if they'll let me have a stamp. If they don't, you'll know I'm thinking of you just the same. I'd call the chipmunk in the backyard after you, Shirley. You don't mind, do you? I thought at first of calling it Anne Shirley, but then I thought that mightn't be respectful. And anyway, Anne doesn't sound so chipmunky. Besides, it might be a gentleman chipmunk. Chipmunks are such darling things, aren't they? But the woman says they eat the rosebush roots. She would, I said. I asked Catherine Brooke where she was going to spend the summer, and she briefly answered, Here. Where did you suppose? I felt as if I ought to ask her to Green Gables,
But I just couldn't. Of course, I don't suppose she'd have come anyway, and she's such a killjoy. She'd spoil everything. But when I think of her alone in that cheap boarding house all summer, my conscience gives me unpleasant jabs. Dusty Miller brought in a live snake the other day and dropped it on the floor of the kitchen. If Rebecca Dew could have turned pale, she would have. "This is really the last straw," she said. But Rebecca Dew is just a little peevish these days because she has to spend all her spare time picking big gray-green beetles off the rose trees and dropping them in a can of kerosene. She thinks there are entirely too many insects in the world. "It's just going to be eaten up by them someday," she predicts mournfully. Nora Nelson is to be married to Jim Wilcox in September. Very quietly, no fuss, no guests, no bridesmaids. Nora told me that was the only way to escape Aunt Mouser, and she will not have Aunt Mouser to see her married. I'm to be present, however, sort of unofficially. Nora says Jim would never have come back if I hadn't set that light in the window. He was going to sell his store and go west. Well, when I think of all the matches I'm supposed to have made... Sally says they'll fight most of their time, but that they'll be happier fighting with each other than agreeing with anybody else. But I don't think they'll fight much. I think it is just misunderstanding that makes most of the trouble in the world. You and I for so long. Now, good night, belovedest. Your sleep will be sweet if there is any influence in the wishes of your own. P.S. The above sentence is quoted verbatim from a letter of Aunt Shatty's grandmother. The Second Year. Chapter 18. Windy Poplars, Spooks Lane, September 14th. I can hardly reconcile myself to the fact that our beautiful 2 months are over. They were beautiful, weren't they, dearest? And now it will be only 2 years before... Several paragraphs omitted. But there has been a good deal of pleasure in coming back to Windy Poplars, to my own private tower and my own special chair and my own lofty bed, and even Dusty Miller basking on the kitchen windowsill. The widows were glad to see me, and Rebecca Dew said frankly, "It's good to have you back." Little Elizabeth felt the same way. We had a rapturous meeting at the Green Gate. "I was a little afraid you might have got into tomorrow before me," said little Elizabeth. "Isn't this a lovely evening?" I said. "Where you are, it's always a lovely evening, Miss Shirley," said little Elizabeth. Talk of compliments. "How have you put in the summer, darling?" I asked. "Thinking," said little Elizabeth softly, "of all the lovely things that will happen in tomorrow." Then we went up to the tower room and read a story about elephants. Little Elizabeth is very much interested in elephants at present. "There is something bewitching about the very name of elephant, isn't there?" she said gravely, holding her chin in her small hands after a fashion she has. "I expect to meet lots of elephants in tomorrow." We put an elephant park in our map of fairyland. It is no use looking superior and disdainful, my Gilbert, as I know you will be looking when you read this. Not a bit of use. The world always will have fairies. It can't get along without them, and somebody has to supply them. It's rather nice to be back at school, too. Catherine Brooke isn't any more companionable, but my pupils seemed glad to see me, and Jen Pringle wants me to help her make the tin halos for the angels' heads in a Sunday school concert. I think the course of study this year will be much more interesting than last year. Canadian history has been added to the curriculum. I have to give a little lecturette tomorrow on the War of 1812. It seems so strange to read over the stories of those old wars, things that can never happen again. I don't suppose any of us will ever have more than an academic interest in battles long ago. It's impossible to think of Canada ever being at war again. I'm so thankful that phase of history is over. We are going to reorganize the dramatic club at once and canvass every family connected with the school for a subscription. Lewis Allen and I are going to take the Dawlish Road as our territory and canvass it next Saturday afternoon. Lewis will try to kill two birds with one stone, as he is competing for a prize offered by Country Homes for the best photograph of an attractive farmhouse. The prize is $25, and that will mean a badly needed new suit and overcoat for Lewis. He worked on a farm all summer and is doing housework and waiting on the table at his boarding house again this year. He must hate it, but he never says a word about it. I do like Lewis. He is so plucky and ambitious, with a charming grin in place of a smile. And he really isn't overstrong. I was afraid last year he would break down. But his summer on the farm seems to have built him up a bit. This is his last year in High, and then he hopes to achieve a year at Queen's. The widows are going to ask him to Sunday night supper as often as possible this winter. Aunt Kate and I have had a conference on ways and means, and I persuaded her to let me put up the extras. Of course, we didn't try to persuade Rebecca Dew. I merely asked Aunt Kate in Rebecca's hearing if I could have Lewis Allen in on Sunday nights at least twice a month. Aunt Kate said coldly she was afraid they couldn't afford it, in addition to their usual lonely girl. Rebecca Dew uttered a cry of anguish. "This is the last straw. Getting so poor we can't afford a bite now and again to a poor, hard-working, sober boy who is trying to get an education. You pay more for liver for that cat and him ready to burst. Well, take $1 off my wages and have him." The gospel according to Rebecca was accepted. Lewis Allen is coming, and neither Dusty Miller's liver nor Rebecca Dew's wages will be less. Dear Rebecca Dew. Aunt Shatty crept into my room last night to tell me she wanted to get a beaded cape, but that Aunt Kate thought she was too old for it, and her feelings had been hurt. "Do you think I am, Miss Shirley? I don't want to be undignified, but I've always wanted a beaded cape so much. I always thought they were what you might call jaunty, and now they're in again." "Too old? Of course you're not too old, dearest," I assured her. "Nobody is ever too old to wear just what she wants to wear. You wouldn't want to wear it if you were too old." "I shall get it, and defy Kate," said Aunt Shatty, anything but defiantly. "But I think she will, and I think I know how to reconcile Aunt Kate." I'm alone in my tower. Outside there is a still, still night, and the silence is velvety. Not even the poplars are stirring. I have just leaned out of my window and blown a kiss in the direction of somebody not 100 miles away from Kingsport. Chapter 19. The Dawlish Road was a meandering sort of road, and the afternoon was made for wanderers. Or so Anne and Louis thought as they prowled along it, now and then pausing to enjoy a sudden sapphire glimpse of the strait through the trees, or to snap a particularly lovely bit of scenery or picturesque little house in a leafy hollow. It was not, perhaps, quite so pleasant to call at the houses themselves and ask for subscriptions for the benefit of the dramatic club, but Anne and Louis took turns doing the talking, he taking on the women while Anne manipulated the men. "Take the men, if you're going in that dress and hat," Rebecca Dew had advised. "I've had a good bit of experience in canvassing in my day, and it all went to show that the better dressed and better looking you are, the more money, or promise of it, you'll get, if it's the men you have to tackle. But if it's the women, put on the oldest and ugliest things you have." "Isn't a road an interesting thing, Louis?" said Anne dreamily. "Not a straight road, but one with ends and kinks around which anything of beauty and surprise may be lurking. I've always loved bends in roads." "Where does this Dawlish Road go to?" asked Louis practically, though at the same time he was reflecting that Miss Shirley's voice always made him think of spring. "I might be horrid and schoolteacherish, Louis, and say that it doesn't go anywhere. It stays right here. But I won't. As to where it goes or where it leads to, who cares? To the end of the world and back, perhaps. Remember what Emerson says?
Oh, what have I to do with time? That's our motto for today. I expect the universe will muddle on if we let it alone for a while. Look at those cloud shadows, and that tranquility of green valleys, and that house with an apple tree at each end of its corners. Imagine it in spring. This is one of the days people feel alive, and every wind of the world is a sister. I'm glad there are so many clumps of spice ferns along this road. Spice ferns with gossamer webs on them. It brings back the days when I pretended, or believed, I think I really did believe, that gossamer webs were felines' tablecloths. They found a wayside spring in a golden hollow and sat down on a moss that seemed made of tiny ferns to drink from a cup that Lewis twisted out of birch bark. "You never know the real joy of drinking till you're dry with thirst and find water," he said. "That summer I worked out west on the railroad they were building. I got lost on the prairie one hot day and wandered for hours. I thought I'd die of thirst, and then I came to a settler's shack, and he had a little spring like this in a clump of willows. How I drank! I've understood the Bible and its love of good water better ever since." "We're going to get some water from another quarter," said Anne rather anxiously. "There's a shower coming up, and, Louis, I love showers, but I've got on my best hat and my second-best dress, and there isn't a house within half a mile." "There's an old deserted blacksmith's forge over there," said Louis, "but we'll have to run for it." Run they did, and from its shelter enjoyed the shower as they enjoyed everything else on that carefree, gypsying afternoon. A veiled hush had fallen over the world. All the young breezes that had been whispering and rustling so importantly along the Dawlish road had folded their wings and become motionless and soundless. Not a leaf stirred, not a shadow flickered. The maple leaves at the bend of the road turned wrong side out until the trees looked as if they were turning pale from fear. A huge, cold shadow seemed to engulf them like a green wave. The cloud had reached them. Then the rain, with a rush and sweep of wind. The shower pattered sharply down on the leaves, dancing along the smoky red road, and pelted the roof of the old forge right merrily. "If this lasts," said Louis. But it didn't. As suddenly as it had come up, it was over, and the sun was shining on the wet, glistening trees. Dazzling glimpses of blue sky appeared between the torn white clouds. Far away, they could see a hill still dim with rain, but below them the cup of the valley seemed to brim over with peach-tinted mists. The woods around were pranked out with a sparkle and glitter as of springtime, and a bird began to sing in the big maple over the forge as if he were cheated into believing it really was springtime, so amazingly fresh and sweet did the world seem all at once. "Let's explore this," said Anne when they resumed their tramp, looking along a little side road running between old rail fences smothered in goldenrod. "I don't think there's anybody living along that road," said Louis doubtfully. "I think it's only a road running down to the harbor." "Never mind. Let's go along it. I've always had a weakness for side roads, something off the beaten track, lost and green and lonely. Smell the wet grass, Louis. Besides, I feel in my bones that there is a house on it, a certain kind of house, a very snappable house." Anne's bones did not deceive her. Soon there was a house, and a snappable house to boot. It was a quaint, old-fashioned one, low in the eaves, with square, small-paned windows. Big willows stretched patriarchal arms over it, and an apparent wilderness of perennials and shrubs crowded all about it. It was weather-gray and shabby, but the big barns beyond it were snug and prosperous-looking, up-to-date in every respect. "I've always heard, Miss Shirley, that when a man's barns are better than his house, it's a sign that his income exceeds his expenditure," said Louis, as they sauntered up the deep-rutted grassy lane. "I should think it was a sign that he thought more of his horses than of his family," laughed Anne. "I'm not expecting a subscription to our club here, but that's the most likely house for a prize contest we've encountered yet. Its grayness won't matter in a photograph." "This lane doesn't look as if it were much traveled,"
said Louis with a shrug. "Evidently the folk who live here aren't strongly sociable. I'm afraid we'll find they don't even know what a dramatic club is. Anyhow, I'm going to secure my picture before we rouse any of them from their lair." The house seemed deserted, but after the picture was taken, they opened a little white gate, crossed the yard, and knocked on a faded blue kitchen door, the front door evidently being like that of Windy Poplars, more for show than for use, if a door literally hidden in Virginia creeper could be said to be for show. They expected at least the civility which they had hitherto met in their calls, whether backed up with generosity or not. Consequently, they were decidedly taken aback when the door was jerked open, and on the threshold appeared not the smiling farmer's wife or daughter they had expected to see, but a tall, broad-shouldered man of 50, with grizzled hair and bushy eyebrows, who demanded unceremoniously, "What do you want?" "We have called hoping to interest you in our high school dramatic club," began Anne rather lamely, but she was spared further effort. "Never heard of it. Don't want to hear about it. Nothing to do with it," was the uncompromising interruption, and the door was promptly shut in their faces. "I believe we've been snubbed," said Anne as they walked away. "Nice, amiable gentleman, that," grinned Louis. "I'm sorry for his wife if he has one." "I don't think he can have, or she would civilize him a trifle," said Anne, trying to recover her shattered poise. "I wish Rebecca Dew had the handling of him, but we've got his house at least, and I've a premonition that it's going to win the prize. Bother, I've just got a pebble in my shoe. I'm going to sit down on my gentleman's stone dike, with or without his permission, and remove it." "Luckily it's out of sight of the house," said Louis. Anne had just retied her shoelace when they heard something pushing softly through the jungle of shrubbery on their right. Then a small boy, about 8 years of age, came into view and stood surveying them bashfully, with a big apple turnover clasped tightly in his chubby hands. He was a pretty child, with glossy brown curls, big trustful brown eyes, and delicately modeled features. There was an air of refinement about him, in spite of the fact that he was bareheaded and bare-legged, with only a faded blue cotton shirt and a pair of threadbare velvet knickerbockers between head and legs. But he looked like a small prince in disguise. Just behind him was a big black Newfoundland dog, whose head was almost on a level with the lad's shoulder. Anne looked at him with a smile that always won children's hearts. "Hello, Sonny," said Louis. "Who belongs to you?" The boy came forward with an answering smile, holding out his turnover. "This is for you to eat," he said shyly. "Dad made it for me, but I'd rather give it to you. I've lots to eat." Louis, rather tactlessly, was on the point of refusing to take the little chap's snack, but Anne gave him a quick nudge. Taking the hint, he accepted it gravely and handed it to Anne, who, quite as gravely, broke it in two and gave half of it back to him. They knew they must eat it, and they had painful doubts as to Dad's ability in the cooking line, but the first mouthful reassured them. Dad might not be strong on courtesy, but he could certainly make turnovers. "This is delicious," said Anne. "What is your name, dear?" "Teddy Armstrong," said the small benefactor. "But Dad always calls me little fellow. I'm all he has, you know. Dad is awful fond of me, and I'm awful fond of Dad. I'm afraid you think my dad is impolite 'cause he shut that door so quick, but he doesn't mean to be. I heard you asking for something to eat." "We didn't, but it doesn't matter," thought Anne. "I was in the garden behind the hollyhocks, so I just thought I'd bring you my turnover, 'cause I'm always so sorry for poor people who haven't plenty to eat. I have, always. My dad is a splendid cook. You ought to see the rice puddings he can make." "Does he put raisins in them?" asked Louis with a smile. "Lots and lots. There's nothing mean about my dad." "Haven't you any mother, darling?" asked Anne. "No, my mother is dead. Mrs. Merrill told me once she'd gone to heaven, but my dad says there's no such place, and I guess he ought to know. My dad is an awful wise man. He's read thousands of books.
I mean to be exactly like him when I grow up. Only I'll always give people things to eat when they want them. My dad isn't very fond of people, but he's awful good to me."
"Do you go to school?" asked Louis.
"No, my dad teaches me at home. The trustees told him I'd have to go next year, though. I think I'd like to go to school and have some other boys to play with. Of course, I've got Carlo, and Dad himself is splendid to play with when he has time. My dad is pretty busy, He has to run the farm and keep the house clean, too. That's why he can't be bothered having people around, you see. When I get bigger, I'll be able to help him lots, and then he'll have more time to be polite to folks."
"That turnover was just about right, little fellow," said Louis, swallowing the last crumb. The little fellow's eyes beamed.
"I'm so glad you liked it," he said.
"Would you like to have your picture taken?" said Anne, feeling that it would never do to offer this generous small soul money. "If you would, Louis will take it."
"Oh, wouldn't I?"
said the little fellow eagerly.
"Carlo, too?"
"Certainly, Carlo, too." Anne posed the two prettily before a background of shrubs, the little lad standing with his arm about his big, curly playmate's neck, both dog and boy seeming equally well pleased, and Louis took the picture with his last remaining plate. "If it comes out well, I'll send you one by mail," he promised. "How shall I address it?"
"Teddy Armstrong, care of Mr. James Armstrong, Glen Cove Road," said the little fellow. "Oh, won't it be fun to have something come in to me myself through the post office? I tell you, I'll feel awful proud. I won't say a word to Dad about it, so that it'll be a splendid surprise for him."
"Well, look out for your parcel in 2 or 3 weeks," said Louis as they bade him goodbye. But Anne suddenly stooped and kissed the little sunburned face. There was something about it that tugged at her heart. He was so sweet, so gallant, so motherless. They looked back at him before a curve in the lane, and saw him standing on the dike with his dog, waving his hand to them. Of course, Rebecca Dew knew all about the Armstrongs. "James Armstrong has never got over his wife's death 5 years ago," she said. "He wasn't so bad before that. Agreeable enough, though a bit of a hermit. Kind of built that way. He was just wrapped up in his bit of a wife. She was 20 years younger than he was. Her death was an awful shock to him, I've heard. Just seemed to change his nature completely. Got sour and cranky. Wouldn't even get a housekeeper. Looked after his house and child himself. He kept bachelor's hall for years before he was married, so he ain't a bad hand at it."
"But it's no life for the child," said Aunt Shatty. "His father never takes him to church or anywhere he'd see people."
"He worships the boy, I've heard," said Aunt Kate.
"Thou shalt have no other gods before me,"
quoted Rebecca Dew suddenly. Chapter 20. It was almost 3 weeks before Louis found time to develop his pictures. He brought them up to Windy Poplars the first Sunday night he came to supper. Both the house and the little fellow came out splendidly. The little fellow smiled up from the picture. "As real as life," said Rebecca Dew.
"Why, he looks like you, Louis," exclaimed Anne.
"He does that," agreed Rebecca Dew, squinting at it judicially. "The minute I saw it, his face reminded me of somebody, but I couldn't think who."
"Why, the eyes, the forehead, the whole expression are yours, Louis," said Anne.
"It's hard to believe I was ever such a good-looking little chap," shrugged Louis. "I got a picture of myself somewhere, taken when I was 8. I must hunt it out and compare it. You'd laugh to see it, Miss Shirley. I'm the most sober-eyed kid with long curls and a lace collar, looking stiff as a ramrod. I suppose I had my head clamped in one of those 3-clawed contraptions they used to use. If this picture really resembles me, it must be only a coincidence. The little fellow can't be any relation of mine. I haven't any relative on the island now." "Where were you born?" asked Aunt Kate. "N.B. Father and Mother died when I was 10, and I came over here to live with a cousin of Mother's. I called her Aunt Ida. She died too, 3 years ago."
"Jim Armstrong came from New Brunswick?" said Rebecca Dew.
"He ain't a real islander. Wouldn't be such a crank if he was. We have our peculiarities, but we're civilized."
"I'm not sure I want to discover a relation in the amiable Mr. Armstrong," grinned Louis, attacking Aunt Shatty's cinnamon toast. "However, I think when I get the photograph finished and mounted, I'll take it out to Glen Cove Road myself and investigate a little. He may be a distant cousin or something. I really know nothing about my mother's people, if she had any living. I've always been under the impression that she hadn't. Father hadn't, I know." "If you take the picture out in person, won't the little fellow be a bit disappointed over losing his thrill of getting something through the post office?" said Anne.
"I'll make it up to him. I'll send him something else by mail."
The next Saturday afternoon, Louis came driving along Spook's Lane in an antiquated buggy behind a still more antiquated mare.
"I'm going out to Glen Cove to take little Teddy Armstrong his picture, Miss Shirley. If my dash and turnout doesn't give you heart failure, I'd like to have you come too. I don't think any of the wheels will fall off." "Where on earth did you pick up that relic?" demanded Rebecca Dew.
"Don't poke fun at my gallant steed, Miss Dew. Have some respect for age. Mr. Bender lent me both mare and buggy on condition I'd do an errand for him along the Dawlish Road. I hadn't time to walk out to Glen Cove today and back."
"Time," said Rebecca Dew. "I could walk there and back myself faster than that animal."
"And carry a bag of potatoes back for Mr. Bender?"
"You wonderful woman."
Rebecca Dew's red cheeks grew even redder.
"It ain't nice to make fun of your elders," she said rebukingly.
Then, by way of coals of fire,
"Could you do with a few doughnuts before you start out?"
The white mare, however, developed surprising powers of locomotion when they were once more out in the open. Anne giggled to herself as they jogged along the road. What would Mrs. Gardner or even Aunt Jamesina say if they could see her now? Well, she didn't care. It was a wonderful day for a drive through a land that was keeping its old, lovely ritual of autumn, and Louis was a good companion. Louis would attain his ambitions. Nobody else of her acquaintance, she reflected, would dream of asking her to go driving in the Bender buggy behind the Bender mare. But it never occurred to Louis that there was anything odd about it. What difference how you traveled as long as you got there? The calm rims of the upland hills were as blue, the roads as red, the maples as gorgeous, no matter what vehicle you rode in. Louis was a philosopher, and cared as little what people might say as he did when some of the high school pupils called him sissy because he did housework for his board. Let them call. Some day the laugh would be on the other side. His pockets might be empty, but his head wasn't. Meanwhile, the afternoon was an idyll, and they were going to see the little fellow again. They told Mr. Bender's brother-in-law about their errand when he put the bag of potatoes in the back of the buggy.
"Do you mean to say you've got a photo of little Teddy Armstrong?"
exclaimed Mr. Merrill.
"That I have, and a good one."
Louis unwrapped it and held it proudly out.
"I don't believe a professional photographer could have taken a better."
Mr. Merrill slapped his leg resoundingly.
"Well, if that don't beat all. Why, little Teddy Armstrong is dead."
"Dead!" exclaimed Anne in horror. "Oh, Mr. Merrill, no! Don't tell me! That dear little boy!"
"Sorry, miss, but it's a fact. And his father is just about wild, and all the worse that he hasn't got any kind of a picture of him at all. And now you've got a good one. Well, well."
It seems impossible," said Anne, her eyes full of tears. She was seeing the slender little figure waving his farewell from the dike.
"Sorry to say, it's only too true. He died nearly 3 weeks ago. Pneumonia. Suffered awful, but he was just as brave and patient as anyone could be, they say. I don't know what'll become of Jim Armstrong now. Say he's like a crazy man. just moping and muttering to himself all the time. If only I had a picture of my little fella, he keeps saying.
I'm sorry for that man, said Mrs. Merrill suddenly. She had not hitherto spoken, standing by her husband, a gaunt, square-built gray woman in wind-whipped calico and check apron. He's well-to-do, and I've always felt he looked down on us because we were poor. But we have our boy, and it don't never matter how poor you are as long as you've got something to love. Anne looked at Mrs. Merrill with a new respect. Mrs. Merrill was not beautiful, but as her sunken gray eyes met Anne's, something of a spirit kinship was acknowledged between them. Anne had never seen Mrs. Merrill before and never saw her again, but she always remembered her as a woman who had attained to the ultimate secret of life. You were never poor as long as you had something to love. The golden day was spoiled for Anne. Somehow, the little fellow had won her heart in their brief meeting. She and Louis drove in silence down the Glen Cove Road and up the grassy lane. Carlo was lying on the stone before the blue door. He got up and came down over to them as they descended from the buggy, licking Anne's hand and looking up at her with big, wistful eyes, as if asking for news of his little playmate. The door was open, and in the dim room beyond they saw a man with his head bowed on the table. At Anne's knock, he started up and came to the door. She was shocked at the change in him. He was hollow-cheeked, haggard, and unshaven, and his deep-set eyes flashed with a fitful fire. She expected a repulse at first, but he seemed to recognize her, for he said listlessly, "So you're back. The little fellow said you talked to him and kissed him. He liked you. I was sorry I'd been so churlish to you. What is it you want?" "We want to show you something," said Anne gently. "Will you come in and sit down?" he said drearily. Without a word, Louis took the little fellow's picture from its wrappings and held it out to him. He snatched it up, gave it one amazed, hungry look, then dropped on his chair and burst into tears and sobs. Anne had never seen a man weep so before. She and Louis stood in mute sympathy until he had regained his self-control. "Oh, you don't know what this means to me," he said brokenly at last. "I hadn't any picture of him, and I'm not like other folks. I can't recall a face. I can't see faces as most folks can in their mind. It's been awful since the young fellow died. I couldn't even remember what he looked like. And now you brought me this, after I was so rude to you. Sit down. Sit down. I wish I could express my thanks in some way. I guess you've saved my reason. Maybe my life. Oh, miss, isn't it like him? You'd think he was going to speak. My dear little fellow. How am I going to live without him? I got nothing to live for now. First his mother, now him." "He was a dear little lad," said Anne tenderly. "That he was, little Teddy. Theodore, his mother named him. Her gift of God's, she said he was. He was so patient and never complained. Once he smiled up in my face and said, 'Dad, I think you've been mistaken in one thing, just one. I guess there is a heaven, isn't there? Isn't there, Dad?' And I said to him, yes, there was. God forgive me for ever trying to teach him anything else. He smiled again, contented-like, and said, 'Well, Dad, I'm going there, and Mother and God are there, so I'll be pretty well off. But I'm worried about you, Dad. You'll be so awful lonesome without me. But just do the best you can, and be polite to folks, and come to us by and by.' He made me promise I'd try, but when he was gone, I couldn't stand the blankness of it. I'd have gone mad if you hadn't brought me this. It won't be so hard now." He talked about his little fellow for some time, as if he found relief and pleasure in it. His reserve and gruffness seemed to have fallen from him like a garment. Finally, Louis produced the small, faded photograph of himself and showed it to him. "Have you ever seen anybody who looked like that, Mr. Armstrong?" asked Anne. Mr. Armstrong peered at it in perplexity.
"It's awful like the little fellow," he said at last. "Whose might it be?"
"Mine," said Louis. "When I was 7 years old, it was because of the strange resemblance to Teddy that Miss Shirley made me bring it to show you. I thought it possible that you and I or the little fellow might be some distant relation. My name is Louis Allen, and my father was George Allen. I was born in New Brunswick."
James Armstrong shook his head. Then he said, "What was your mother's name?"
"Mary Gardner."
James Armstrong looked at him for a moment in silence. "She was my half-sister," he said at last. "I hardly knew her, never saw her but once. I was brought up in an uncle's family after my father's death. My mother married again and moved away. She came to see me once and brought her little daughter. She died soon after, and I never saw my half-sister again. When I came over to the island to live, I lost all trace of her. You were my nephew, and the little fellow's cousin."
This was surprising news to a lad who had fancied himself alone in the world. Louis and Anne spent the whole evening with Mr. Armstrong, and found him to be a well-read and intelligent man. Somehow they both took a liking to him. His former inhospitable reception was quite forgotten, and they saw only the real worth of the character and temperament below the unpromising shell that had hitherto concealed them. "Of course the little fellow couldn't have loved his father so much if it hadn't been so," said Anne, as she and Louis drove back to Windy Poplars through the sunset. When Louis Allen went the next weekend to see his uncle, the latter said to him,
"Lad, come and live with me. You are my nephew, and I can do well for you, what I'd have done for my little fellow if he'd lived. You're alone in the world, and so am I. I need you. I'll grow hard and bitter again if I live here alone. I want you to help me keep my promise to the little fellow. His place is empty. Come you and fill it."
"Thank you, Uncle.
"I'll try,"
said Louis, holding out his hand.
"And bring that teacher of yours here once in a while. I like that girl. The little fellow liked her. Dad," he said to me, "I didn't think I'd ever like anybody but you to kiss me, but I liked it when she did. There was something in her eyes, Dad."
Chapter 21. "The old porch thermometer says it's 0, and the new side door one says it's 10 above," remarked Anne one frosty December night, "so I don't know whether to take my muff or not."
"Better go by the old thermometer," said Rebecca Dew cautiously. "It's probably more used to our climate. Where are you going this cold night, anyway?"
"I'm going round to Temple Street to ask Catherine Brooke to spend the Christmas holidays with me at Green Gables."
"You'll spoil your holidays, then," said Rebecca Dew solemnly. "She'd go about snubbing the angels, that one. That is, if she ever condescended to enter heaven. And the worst of it is, she's proud of her bad manners. Thinks it shows her strength of mind, no doubt."
"My brain agrees with every word you say, but my heart simply won't," said Anne. "I feel, in spite of everything, that Catherine Brooke is only a shy, unhappy girl under her disagreeable rind. I can never make any headway with her in Summerside, but if I can get her to Green Gables, I believe it will thaw her out."
"You won't get her. She won't go," predicted Rebecca Dew. "Probably she'll take it as an insult to be asked. Think you're offering her charity. We asked her here once to Christmas dinner, the year afore you came. You remember? Mrs. McComber, the year we had 2 turkeys give us, and didn't know how we was to get 'em at. And all she said was, 'No, thank you. If there's anything I hate, it's the word Christmas.'"
"But that is so dreadful, hating Christmas. Something has to be done, Rebecca Dew. I'm going to ask her. And I've a queer feeling in my thumbs that tells me she will come."
Somehow, said Rebecca Dew reluctantly, when you say a thing is going to happen, a body believes it will. You haven't got a second sight, have you? Captain Macomber's mother had it? You used to give me the creeps.
I don't think I have anything that need give you creeps. It's only just... I've had a feeling for some time that Catherine Brooke is almost crazy with loneliness under her bitter outside, and that my invitation will come pat to the psychological moment, Rebecca Dew.
I'm not a B.A., said Rebecca with awful humility, and I do not deny your right to use words I cannot always understand. Neither do I deny that you can wind people round your little finger. Look how you manage the Pringles. But I do say, I pity you if you take that iceberg and nutmeg grater combined home with you for Christmas.
Anne was by no means as confident as she pretended to be during her walk to Temple Street. Catherine Brooke had really been unbearable of late. Again and again, Anne, rebuffed, had said as grimly as Poe's raven, "Never more." Only yesterday, Catherine had been positively insulting at a staff meeting, but in an unguarded moment, Anne had seen something looking out of the older girl's eyes, a passionate, half-frantic something, like a caged creature mad with discontent. Anne spent the first half of the night trying to decide whether to invite Catherine Brooke to Green Gables or not. Finally, she fell asleep with her mind irrevocably made up. Catherine's landlady showed Anne into the parlor and shrugged a fat shoulder when she asked for Miss Brooke.
I'll tell her you're here, but I don't know if she'll come down. She's sulking. I told her at dinner tonight that Mrs. Rollins says it's scandalous the way she dresses for a teacher in Summerside High, and she took it high and mighty as usual.
I don't think you should have told Miss Brooke that, said Anne reproachfully.
But I thought she ought to know,
said Mrs. Dennis, somewhat waspishly. Do you also think that she ought to know that the inspector said she was one of the best teachers in the Maritimes? Asked Anne. Or didn't you know it?
Oh, I heard it. But she's stuck up enough now without making her any worse. Proud's no name for it. But what she's got to be proud of, I don't know. Of course, she was mad anyhow tonight because I'd said she couldn't have a dog. She took a notion into her head she'd like to have a dog. Said she'd pay for his rations and see he was no bother. But what'd I do with him when she was in school? I put my foot down. I'm boarding no dog, says I.
Oh, Mrs. Dennis, wouldn't you let her have a dog? He wouldn't bother you much. You could keep him in the basement while she was in school. And a dog really is such a protection at night. I wish you would. Please. There was always something about Anne Shirley's eyes when she said please that people found hard to resist. Mrs. Dennis, in spite of her fat shoulders and a meddlesome tongue, was not unkind at heart. Catherine Brooke simply got under her skin at times with her ungracious ways. I don't know why you should worry as to her having a dog or not. I didn't know you were such friends. She hasn't any friends. I never had such an unsociable boarder. I think that is why she wants a dog, Mrs. Dennis. None of us can live without some kind of companionship.
Well, it's the first human thing I've noticed about her, said Mrs. Dennis. I don't know as I have any awful objection to a dog, but she sort of vexed me with her sarcastic way of asking. I suppose you wouldn't consent if I asked you if I might have a dog, Mrs. Dennis, she says haughty-like. Set her up with it. You're supposing right, says I, as haughty as herself. I don't like eating my words any more than most people, but you can tell her she can have a dog, as she'll guarantee he won't misbehave in the parlor.
Anne did not think the parlor could be much worse if the dog did misbehave. She eyed the dingy lace curtains and the hideous purple roses on the carpet with a shiver. I'm sorry for anyone who has to spend Christmas in a boarding house like this, she thought. I don't wonder Catherine hates the world. I'd like to give this place a good airing. It smells of 1,000 meals. Why does Catherine go on boarding here when she has a good salary?
She says you can come up, was the message Mrs. Dennis brought back rather dubiously, for Miss Brooke had run true to form. The narrow, steep stair was repellent. It didn't want you. Nobody would go up who didn't have to. The linoleum in the hall was worn to shreds. The little back hall bedroom where Anne presently found herself was even more cheerless than the parlor. It was lighted by one glaring, unshaded gas jet. There was an iron bed with a valley in the middle of it, and a narrow, sparsely draped window, looking out on a backyard garden where a large crop of tin cans flourished. But beyond it was a marvelous sky, and a row of Lombardies standing out against long, purple, distant hills. "Oh, Miss Brooke, look at that sunset," said Anne rapturously, from the squeaky, cushionless rocker to which Catherine had ungraciously pointed her. "I've seen a good many sunsets," said the latter coldly without moving. "Condescending to me with your sunsets," she thought bitterly. "You haven't seen this one. No two sunsets are alike. Just sit down here and let it sink into our souls," said Anne. "Thought, Anne, do you ever say anything pleasant?" "Don't be ridiculous, please." "The most insulting words in the world," with an added edge of insult in Catherine's contemptuous tones. Anne turned from her sunset and looked at Catherine, much more than half inclined to get up and walk out. But Catherine's eyes looked a trifle strange. Had she been crying? Surely not. You couldn't imagine Catherine Brooke crying. "You don't make me feel very welcome," Anne said slowly. "I can't pretend things. I haven't your notable gift for doing the Queen act, saying exactly the right thing to everyone. You're not welcome. What sort of room is this to welcome anyone to?" Catherine made a scornful gesture at the faded walls, the shabby bare chairs, and the wobbly dressing table with its petticoat of limp muslin. "It isn't a nice room, but why do you stay here if you don't like it?" "Oh, why? Why? You wouldn't understand. It doesn't matter. I don't care what anybody thinks. What brought you here tonight? I don't suppose you came just to soak in the sunset." "I came to ask if you would spend the Christmas holidays with me at Green Gables." Now, thought Anne, for another broadside of sarcasm. I do wish she'd sit down at least. She just stands there as if waiting for me to go. But there was silence for a moment. Then Catherine said slowly, "Why do you ask me? It isn't because you like me. Even you couldn't pretend that." "It's because I can't bear to think of any human being spending Christmas in a place like this," said Anne candidly. The sarcasm came then. "Oh, I see. A seasonable outburst of charity. I'm hardly a candidate for that yet, Miss Shirley." Anne got up. She was out of patience with this strange, aloof creature. She walked across the room and looked Catherine squarely in the eye. "Catherine Brooke, whether you know it or not, what you want is a good spanking." They gazed at each other for a moment. "It must have relieved you to say that," said Catherine. But somehow the insulting tone had gone out of her voice. There was even a faint twitch at the corner of her mouth. "It has," said Anne. "I've been wanting to tell you just that for some time. I didn't ask you to Green Gables out of charity. You know that perfectly well. I told you my true reason. Nobody ought to spend Christmas here. The very idea is indecent." "You asked me to Green Gables just because you are sorry for me." "Oh, I am sorry for you. Because you shut out life, and now life is shutting you out. Stop it, Catherine. Open your doors to life, and life will come in." "The Anne Shirley version of the old bromide, if you bring a smiling visage to the glass, you meet a smile," said Catherine with a shrug. "Like all bromides, that's absolutely true. Now, are you coming to Green Gables, or are you not?" "What would you say if I accepted? To yourself, not to me." "I'd say you were showing the first faint glimmer of common sense I'd ever detected in you," retorted Anne. Catherine laughed, surprisingly. She walked across to the window, scowled at the fiery streak which was all that was left of the scorned sunset, and then turned. "Very well. I'll go. Now you can go through the motions of telling me you're delighted, and that we'll have a jolly time." "I am delighted, but I don't know if you'll have a jolly time or not. That will depend a good deal on yourself, Miss Brooke." "No, I'll behave myself decently. You'll be surprised. You won't find me a very exhilarating guest, I suppose. But I promise you I won't eat with my knife or insult people when they tell me it's a fine day. I tell you frankly that the only reason I'm going is because even I can't stick the thought of spending the holidays here alone. Mrs. Dennis is going to spend Christmas week with her daughter in Charlottetown. It's a bore to think of getting my own meals. I'm a rotten cook. So much for the triumph of matter over mind. But will you give me your word of honor that you won't wish me a Merry Christmas? I just don't want to be merry at Christmas." "I won't, but I can't answer for the twins." "I'm not going to ask you to sit down here. You'd freeze. But I see that there's a very fine moon in place of your sunset, and I'll walk home with you and help you to admire it if you like." "I do like," said Anne, "but I want to impress on your mind that we have much finer moons in Avonlea." "So she's going?" said Rebecca Dew as she filled Anne's hot water bottle. "Well, Miss Shirley, I hope you never try to induce me to turn Mohammedan, because you'd like to succeed. Where is that cat? Out frisking around Summerside and the weather at 0. "Not by the new thermometer. And Dusty Miller is curled up on the rocking chair by my stove in the tower, snoring with happiness." "Yeah, well," said Rebecca Dew with a little shiver as she shut the kitchen door, "I wish everyone in the world was as warm and sheltered as we are tonight." Chapter 22. Anne did not know that a wistful little Elizabeth was watching out of one of the mansard windows of the Evergreens as she drove away from Windy Poplars, an Elizabeth with tears in her eyes who felt as if everything that made life worth living had gone out of her life for the time being, and that she was the very Lizziest of Lizzies. But when the livery sleigh vanished from her sight around the corner of Spook's Lane, Elizabeth went and knelt down by her bed. "Dear God," she whispered, "I know it isn't any use to ask you for a Merry Christmas for me, because Grandmother and the woman couldn't be merry, but please let my dear Miss Shirley have a merry, merry Christmas, and bring her back safe to me when it's over." "Now," said Elizabeth, getting up from her knees, "I've done all that I can." Anne was already tasting Christmas happiness. She fairly sparkled as the train left the station. The ugly streets slipped past her. She was going home, home to Green Gables. Out in the open country, the world was all golden white and pale violet, woven here and there with the dark magic of spruces and the leafless delicacy of birches. The low sun behind the bare woods seemed rushing through the trees like a splendid god as the train sped on. Catherine was silent, but did not seem ungracious. "Don't expect me to talk," she had warned Anne curtly. "I won't. I hope you don't think I'm one of those terrible people who make you feel that you have to talk to them all the time. We'll just talk when we feel like it. I admit I'm likely to feel like it a good part of the time, but you're under no obligation to take any notice of what I'm saying." Davy met them at Bright River, with a big two-seated sleigh full of furry robes and a bear hug for Anne. The two girls snuggled down in the back seat. The drive from the station to Green Gables had always been a very pleasant part of Anne's weekends home. She always recalled her first drive home from Bright River with Matthew. That had been in spring, and this was December, but everything along the road kept saying to her, "Do you remember?" The snow crisped under the runners. The music of the bells tinkled through the ranks of tall, pointed firs, snow-laden.
The White Way of Delight had little festoons of stars